The wind rattled through the skeleton of the old ranch house where Matthew Langston lived alone. Each gust clawed at the shingles, stripping memories from the walls like the peeling paint on the front porch. News had spread across Rixford Valley that Matthew, the stoic man who had buried his mother, his sister, and then a wife he barely learned to love, had placed an ad for a mail-order bride. Loneliness had carved him hollow, and the townsfolk felt keen sorrow seeing him cling to hope. Then came the letter, terse, neatly written, from a woman named Clara Whitfield. She described herself simply: no dowry, no fanciful dreams, just a willingness to work hard and build something real. When her photograph arrived, it showed a slender woman, dark-haired and solemn-eyed. It was not the bright-eyed beauty some might expect. But to Matthew, there was a quiet resilience in her gaze, the way someone who had suffered still looked forward. She arrived in mid-October, stepping down from the stagecoach in a long travel coat. Flanked by tumbleweed, the station seemed deserted. Matthew stepped forward, posture rigid. Clara extended a gloved hand, and he shook it with practiced politeness. She nodded, measured. From his stance, she could tell he wondered whether she'd vanish like a phantom at sunrise. They rode in silence across the dirt road, past fenced pastures and grazing cattle. Clara's reply to his questions were crisp. She could cook, sew, herd. And she was unafraid of solitude. In the kitchen of his aged ranch house, next to a low-burning stove, they shared a dinner, stew thick with potatoes and carrots, followed by tapioca pudding. Clara kept her back straight. Matthew watched every movement, measured her habits. She ate with proper manners but did not smile. Instead, she seemed to be listening to something beyond the cabin walls. That night, as the wind howled and the house groaned, Clara asked, softly, why he'd chosen a mail-order bride. Matthew looked away. He said there was no one left, that the valley had been good to him but had taken more. Clara listened, then nodded and said, "I will stay, but not for pity." It was the first time her voice trembled. When they climbed the stairs to the single upstairs room, Clara paused on the landing. Her eyes traveled to the wide windows looking out at the silent yard. "Have I made a mistake?" she asked quietly. Matthew closed the door behind them. He turned to her and simply said, "I need you to be here." She exhaled. She understood that it wasn't promises of romance, but a desperate plea from a broken man, and she answered with a tilt of her chin. "Yes." Morning light crept through the curtains. Clara cleaned, swept, and set about her duties, uncharted territory for a stranger in a stranger's home. Though Matthew lingered at the table, nursing black coffee, his eyes softened as he watched her move. The kitchen filled with the scent of bread in the oven. He leaned forward, quietly, the first flicker of expression. Clara's gentle smile in that moment felt like a fragile offering. Outside, a dust cloud rose from the main street. Matthew left Clara to unload the bread and stepped outside. He tipped his hat at the approaching stagecoach, a surprised traveler. Clara emerged, anxious on the threshold, hearing the whisper of dust-choked voices. A woman stepped off, not owning a full smile, but bearing evidence of the stones behind her eyes. She held a letter, wild-eyed. Clara's sister, Ida, who had learned of her whereabouts and come searching. For Clara, it meant unraveling a past she had run from. For Matthew, it threatened the fragile cocoon of their unspoken alliance. Clara's lips parted, her eyes glistened. Matthew crossed to her side. He did not speak, but reached for her hand. Ida moved forward, words tumbling, promises of home, of rescue, of staying. Clara withdrew, but looked to Matthew, hesitation, and at the same time a dawning sense that she might belong. Matthew's jaw tightened. He straightened. The town watched, curious. The dust settled. Here, between a lonely rancher and the woman he barely knew, a story began that none would ever forget. Ida stayed. Not by invitation, but by insistence, pressing her way into the silence between Clara and Matthew with the force of a tide. She claimed a cot in the parlor and filled the space with questions. Why here, Clara? What have you done? Spoken like a litany of suspicion wrapped in sisterly concern. Clara never answered. She rose each dawn before the rooster, scrubbed the floors with raw hands, fed the hens, and kept her eyes low. Matthew did not know what to make of Ida. She spoke fast and often, with opinions sharp as broken glass. She disapproved of the way Clara moved without speaking, of the home's silence, of the lean meals. She called Matthew a ghost of a man once when she thought he wasn't listening. He was. On the fourth evening, a calf was born breech. Matthew called for Clara, knowing she had steadier hands than most men. Together, knees deep in hay and blood, they turned the calf in the womb. It was Clara who whispered to the heifer, calmed it, and eased the birth. When the calf dropped into the straw, steaming and blinking, Clara sat back, slick with sweat, and smiled, not at Matthew, not at the animal, but at herself. That night Matthew poured 2 glasses of rye and waited for Clara by the hearth. When she finally joined him, he offered her the glass. Ida, watching from the staircase, said nothing but turned back up the stairs. Clara took the drink and sat. They didn't speak, but something shifted, like frost thawing along the edge of a window. Then winter came fast, blanketing the ranch in silence. Ida's complaints faded with the cold. She stayed inside, shivering despite the fire, while Clara braved the wind to mend fence lines and break ice for the cattle. Matthew followed her one morning, quietly, watched her from the barn door. She moved with a kind of solemn determination, her scarf pulled tight, hands raw and red. He wanted to ask her why she hadn't left. Instead, he repaired the gate beside her. When their hands brushed on the same hinge, she looked up. Her voice cracked the frost between them. "You don't ask much." "I ask what I can bear to hear," he said. She nodded, eyes narrowed against the sun, then said, "I wasn't rejected, I left him." Matthew waited, she never said who. Ida's departure was not announced. One morning she was simply gone, left a note pinned to the door. "Clara, you are stronger than you know. Forgive me." It was after that Clara began to sing. Low, wordless melodies in the kitchen or among the laundry lines when she thought she was alone. It haunted Matthew more than any spoken word. He found himself lingering outside the door to listen. A sickness swept through town that February. Consumption claimed 3 children and a blacksmith. People came out less, spoke in whispers. Matthew rode into town for supplies and returned pale. Clara met him at the door. "Ellen Parker," he said, "gone this morning." She closed her eyes. They had both known Ellen, Clara through idle church conversations, Matthew through the shared burden of loss. That night, Clara took the whiskey bottle off the shelf and handed it to him. "I think," she said, "we ought to say something. About what's left." Matthew drank, wiped his mouth with his sleeve, and said, "You first." Clara stared into the flames. "I married young. He was kind at first, then he was. He didn't leave bruises where folks could see. But he hollowed me out. I ran, not from shame, but because if I stayed, I'd forget who I was." She looked at Matthew then, not with fear, but with defiance. "So I chose this, this silence. Because it's honest." Matthew placed the bottle down and for the first time reached across and touched her cheek, just once. Then withdrew, neither spoke of it again. By spring, word spread of the kindness that had bloomed at the Langston ranch. A neighbor boy found refuge after his father's rage sent him running. A widow came for Clara's help sewing her daughter's funeral dress. And one day, old Doc Harrison, who rarely left town, rode out just to see if what he'd heard was true. He left with eyes full of quiet reverence. None of them knew what had changed, not exactly. But the mail-order bride who had been rejected nowhere except in her own mind, and the rancher whom grief had nearly swallowed, had stitched something between them stronger than blood. Not love, not yet, but something shaped like the beginning of it. Spring thawed the land slowly that year, like an old wound refusing to close. With the melt came mud, and with mud, the necessary labor of resurrection. Fences bowed under the weight of wind-snapped branches. Chickens wandered too far and didn't return. A black bear was seen nosing the creek, yet Clara rose each morning, her skirts muddy by midday, her hands blistered by dusk. Matthew watched her change. He did not remark on it, but saw how she paused less often, how she no longer flinched at thunder. In the barn, she handled the horses with a calm firmness that earned their trust. And one morning, after she helped a neighbor birth twins, too small, both alive, Clara walked into the kitchen and asked Matthew for a map. He unfolded it across the table. She pointed to a place far west. "This is where I was born," she said. "Haven't seen it since I was a girl. Mama's buried somewhere out there." Matthew didn't ask why she left. Instead, he pointed to a stretch of land bordering his. "This pasture's dying," he said. "If we diverted the creek, built a channel, we could make something of it." Clara nodded once. "Then we'll do it." They began digging 2 days later. Rain came and went, turning the trench into a mess of slick clay and frustration. But they kept at it side by side, neither asking for more than the next shovel of earth. One night, thunder cracked close and sudden. The wind slammed the shutters. Clara stood by the fireplace, watching the flame flicker. Matthew found her there and, without thinking, placed a blanket around her shoulders. She stiffened, then softened. "I used to dread storms," she said. "He'd drink, blame the thunder." Matthew didn't speak. He just stood beside her, both of them facing the fire. She leaned into him, barely a breath's weight. And there, in the hush between lightning and rain, he raised a hand and let it rest on her back. The town noticed things, as towns do. That Matthew came to Sunday services again, sitting at the far end of the pew with Clara quiet beside him. That Clara opened her door to the Havers twins when their father took sick, keeping them 2 nights with never a word of complaint. That the ranch, which had long seemed to mourn its own emptiness, now stood upright and breathing. It was at the early summer fair that things changed. Clara entered a pie into the contest, apple, dusted with cinnamon. Matthew didn't know she'd done it. He found out when he saw her, flustered but proud, standing beside a blue ribbon. Townsfolk clapped her on the shoulder. Some offered praise, others jokes. But it was the old judge, a widow herself, who said, "We've been needing a woman like you." That night Matthew tried to speak. Clara stopped him with a look. "Don't say anything you're not sure of," she said. "I've learned to live without words. What matters is the staying." He nodded. That was enough. Then came the fire. It started on the southern edge of the property, a spark, a snapped wire, maybe a lightning strike. It moved fast through dry grass. By the time Matthew smelled the smoke, the barn roof was aflame. He shouted for Clara. She was already running with buckets. They fought it side by side, smothering embers, freeing the horses. Clara's dress singed. Matthew's hands blistered. They didn't stop until the sky turned gray with ash and the fire lay smoldering, leaving behind a ruin of scorched timber and half-collapsed beams. After, they sat on the porch. Clara's hair was black with soot. Matthew's shirt stuck to his back with sweat and blood. "I thought I'd lost this place again," he said, voice hoarse. Clara didn't answer. She took his hand. It was the first time she'd reached for him. By morning, the town had arrived. Men with axes, women with bread and cloth, children hauling water, not out of duty, but because something had changed. The ranch was no longer the shell of Matthew Langston's grief. It was a place where people had begun to believe in return. And when the rebuilding began, Clara stood at the center of it, not as a bride, not as a guest, but as a woman who had fought fire and stayed. The barn was rebuilt with wide timber and hard hands. It stood taller than before, more solid, with a new loft and a reinforced stall for the colt born just days after the fire. Clara named him Ash. Matthew didn't ask why. He could see the story in her eyes. The days settled back into rhythm, but the silence between them changed. It carried weight now, not from absence but from understanding. Matthew spoke more, sparingly but with care. Clara answered in the same tongue. They built a porch swing together. He carved the slats, she stitched the cushion. They sat on it at dusk, not touching, just listening to the land breathe around them. When the bank agent rode out to inspect the ranch, Matthew let Clara do the talking. She laid out their numbers, their crop projections, their livestock tallies. The man looked at her twice, then back at Matthew. "You run this place together?" he asked. Matthew said, "She runs what matters." The loan extension was approved. That autumn, Clara began teaching letters to the neighbors' children. She used the parlor, cleared the furniture, chalked the wall. Matthew watched the children gather like moths, heads bent, whispering vowels. He built a shelf for her books, nailed it to the wall where sunlight pooled. One night after the children left, Clara found a rough-wrapped parcel on her pillow. Inside, a second-hand volume of poetry, no note. She held it to her chest and wept quietly, not for the gift, but for the fact that someone had seen her want. Word of her teaching reached the township. Soon, Clara was invited to the church hall for Saturday classes. Matthew hitched the wagon for her, waited outside each time. She returned tired, dust on her hem, but always smiling. She began to hum again. Then came the letter. It arrived in a weather-stained envelope, addressed to Clara in a hand Matthew did not recognize. She read it at the edge of the field, away from the house. When she returned, her face was blank, lips pressed tight. He didn't ask. She told him anyway later, in the barn with the scent of straw thick in the air. "He died," she said. "The man I ran from, consumption, alone in a boarding house." Matthew didn't move. "I thought I'd feel free," she whispered, "but it's just empty." He walked to her then, took her hand. "He's dead, you're not." She nodded, "No, I'm not." That night she lay beside him for the first time. They didn't speak, didn't move fast or make vows, just lay close, breath sinking, the weight of years lifting inch by inch. Come winter, the town honored her, a gathering in the hall. She wore a dark green dress Matthew had bought without telling her. She stood beside him as the mayor named her a pillar, thanked her for restoring not just a house, but a heart to the valley. Later at home, she looked out across the snowlit yard and said, "I never imagined I'd be the one who stayed." Matthew stepped beside her. "You weren't chosen," he said. "You chose." She smiled then, for real, the kind that softened even the scars. And when she leaned into him, it wasn't for comfort. It was for belonging, not a bride anymore, not a guest. Clara Whitfield Langston, as the town would later call her, though no ceremony marked the change. She had built her place, not with vows, but with the bones of survival. The snow that year lingered longer than usual. Mornings were sharp with frost, and ice trimmed the fences like brittle lace. But inside the house, warmth took root. Clara rose before dawn, not from duty, but from a restlessness that came with contentment. She took to walking the pasture line with Ash, the colt now grown lean and fast. Matthew watched from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, the steam rising like memory. He'd taken to writing again, not letters, not ledgers, but quiet thoughts on torn paper. Clara found one in the drawer beneath the toolshed latch, not hidden but not offered either. It read, "She came from ash and silence." Now even the land listens to her. She said nothing about it, only placed it back and kissed his cheek that evening without explanation. By March, the schoolhouse was hers 3 days a week. The mayor had offered it without debate. Clara filled its walls with borrowed books and homemade desks. Children once known only by last name came alive under her gaze. They learned quickly that she valued effort over ease, silence over boasting, and questions most of all. Parents who once whispered about the mail-order bride now sent their sons and daughters with pride. One boy, Levi, struggled to speak, stammered so fiercely it knotted his breath. Clara never forced him. Instead, she handed him a slate and let his hand find what his mouth could not. Over time, his voice returned, not perfect but sure. When he read aloud at the harvest festival, Clara stood at the back of the hall, her hands folded, eyes wet. But not all welcomed the change. Elias Monroe, a merchant with ambitions, resented Clara's influence. He'd lost control of certain township decisions once her voice carried weight. He spread rumors, quiet, cutting ones, that she was never lawfully wed, that the ranch was cursed with fire and grief, that Matthew had lost his mind to grief and shame. Clara heard them. So did Matthew. He warned her once, standing by the creek where the channel they'd built still ran strong. "You don't have to prove yourself," he said. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm reminding them that I survived." But it was Monroe who set the final fire. Not with flame, but with lies inked into a petition, a motion to remove Clara from the schoolhouse. He gathered 12 signatures, enough to force a vote. At the town meeting, Clara stood alone before the crowd. The same crowd who'd eaten her pies, thanked her for help, let their children sit beneath her lessons. She didn't plead, didn't raise her voice. She spoke of the children's names, of the ranch she helped restore. Of Matthew, who once had no reason to wake. Monroe interrupted. "You were never chosen. You forced yourself on this town." Clara turned to him. Her voice was cold as snowmelt. "I was not chosen, I chose. That makes all the difference." Silence followed. Then an old widow, once shamed by her own silence, stood. "She made my boy read again." Then Levi's father. "She gave my son a voice." And finally, Matthew. From the back of the room, his voice calm as timber, he said, "She gave me a life." The petition died in that moment, not from lack of votes, but from the weight of truth. Monroe left the meeting hall alone. Clara didn't celebrate. She returned home and worked the fields the next morning like always, but something in her posture had changed. She no longer braced against the wind. Later that week, Matthew found a letter on the table. It wasn't for him, but for the next woman who might one day need to hear what Clara had learned. You will not be loved for arriving. You will be loved for staying, for enduring, for becoming the kind of woman who cannot be unmade by rejection. He folded it and placed it in the drawer where his own words lived. Together, they were writing something no fire could erase. The final summer broke the land open with heat. Grass seared golden by June. Dust curled off the trail in spirals, and the creeks ran thin, murmuring like old men half asleep. The air hung heavy, the kind that made bones ache and tempers fray. But at the Langston Ranch, the days moved with quiet purpose. Clara rose earlier than ever, her belly swelling beneath her apron. No one in town had asked outright, not even after she declined her usual teaching days. They brought fresh milk instead, baskets of greens, offers to sweep and fetch water. Rick's Ford, once prone to whispering, now bowed its head when she passed, not in pity, but in reverence. Matthew had changed too. There was a gentleness in him now, but not softness. His voice still carried that dry timber rasp, but his hands knew how to soothe a horse or cradle Clara's back when she leaned into him on the porch. He planted rows of beans behind the house where wild rye once grew, and he built a new cradle by hand, planing each slat until it gleamed like river rock. Late July brought thunder again. Not the kind that cracked and rolled, but the silent pressure before a storm, the knowing. Clara felt it first, a pain low and sharp, then another. By midnight, she gripped the edge of the table with both hands, sweat trailing her spine. Matthew sent for Doc Harrison, but Clara said no. "I was alone before," she whispered, "but not now." He nodded, lit every lamp, boiled water, held her hand so tight it went numb. The child came hard, hours like centuries. Clara bled, she bit down on cloth. She sobbed once, quiet, afraid, and then in a cry that seemed to come from the deepest canyon in her soul, she bore him out. A son, tiny, dark-haired, fist clenched. Clara held him against her chest, blood and tears mingling, and breathed his name without knowing she'd chosen one, Elijah. Matthew wept then, once, silently. The tears ran down his dust-worn cheeks and vanished into the collar of his shirt. The sun rose red that morning, staining the sky like a wound. But inside the ranch house there was no fire, no grief, no ghosts, only breath, only beginning. Words spread. They came quietly, not all at once. The town, old, weathered people with their own ghosts, came to the fence, to the porch, to the barn. They brought swaddles, loaves, carved wooden animals. They came to see the boy, yes. But more than that, to see the woman who had arrived unwanted and become their anchor. Clara stood with Elijah in her arms and Matthew beside her, his hand at her back. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Later, alone again, she laid the baby in the cradle. The house held its breath. She stepped outside, barefoot, the earth warm beneath her soles. "I stayed," she said to no one or to the wind. "I built this." Behind her, Matthew opened the door, held it for her to return. And that was how it ended, not with applause, not with vows, but with the slow, steady beat of a woman who refused to vanish, who loved not because she was asked, but because she chose. And in choosing, she turned a dying ranch into a home. The town would speak of her for decades, but never quite right. They'd say, she came on a stagecoach, a rejected bride, but those who knew better would say, she came with scars, stayed with fire, and left behind something that could never be taken. And that was enough.